Greetings from the Tech Cave, Fenris here, and today we are going to be discussing battery changes. Now, this is a topic that was actually requested of me to cover, and I was a bit hesitant at first because this topic had been covered front to back by multiple people over the years. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the information is a bit scattered across the wind. So, in light of that, I figured I would do a video focusing on the most common examples of battery changes. So the first step is to demonstrate opening the cartridges, so we can gain access to the battery. Now, in most cases, games that utilize a save function are ones that would require a battery change. Now, there are some exceptions, of course, but in most scenarios, that is the case, and it is integral to change the battery when it dies. Otherwise, you run the risk of the battery potentially popping inside the cartridges, which would cause a lot more damage to the board, like a leaking capacitor would. Starting things off, we have Famicom. Now, I've already covered Famicom cartridges before on my very first video on the channel, but to make it long story short, Famicom cartridges come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, but a good majority of them can be opened with a pair of vice grips and a spudger. Now, later on, Nintendo started producing Famicom cartridges that were of a similar style to NES cartridges, and these only used security bit screws. Next, we have NES. NES cartridges, in the context of battery changes, come in two variants, 5-screw and 3-screw. Now, when it comes to battery changes, the only NES game I can think of that would require it and is a 5-screw would be The Legend of Zelda, but I don't have a 5-screw Zelda to demonstrate this with, so we'll just use Top Gun here as a stand-in. Now, 5 screws just use a small flathead bit, while 3 screws use 3 game bits and 2 top clips to secure the cartridge together. All you need to open these up is a 3.8mm game bit screwdriver. Next we have the Super Famicom, and opening these and SNES carts are the exact same process. They just have 2 3.8mm game bit screws and 2 top clips holding them together. Next we have Game Boy Color. This and Game Boy carts open up the exact same way, in that they have 1 game bit screw and the front cover just slides off. Game Boy Advance cartridges open up just like Game Boy and Game Boy Color, but these use a tri-wing screw instead. Now, there are some GBA games that do use the batteries for saves, but I specifically picked Pokemon for a reason, which we will get into much later, but for now, let's open it up. Now we're getting into the cartridges that are a little more involved, starting with the N64. These have 2 game bit screws like NES and SNES, but unlike those cartridges, have a shield inside that is held down with 2 small Phillips head bits. And now we have reached the Sega Genesis. Now, there are multiple examples of opening Sega Genesis cartridges, but for this demonstration, we're going to be sticking with the standard Genesis cartridges as well as the EA Genesis cartridges. Starting with the standard, these are often held together with 2 4.5mm game bits. But every now and then, you'll have a Genesis cartridge that is held together with Torx bits. Now, the specific Torx bit you will need has a small hole in the center of it. So keep that in mind when you have like a multi-tool set here that you have a Torx bit that has a small little divot in it for this security pin. Now, when it comes to EA cartridges, these get a little more all over the place. These use 5 different screws, that being 3.8mm game bit, 4.5mm game bit, Torx, which I don't have an example here, Phillips, and even these weird security screws that I'm not entirely sure the name of. Now, unlike the other screws, these ones we will be replacing after we open it, because the only bit that I can find that opens these cannot fasten them back into place. And this is the bit in question. Now, I'm not sure what this bit is called, and my toolkit just lists it as a 2.6 bit, but as you can see, it's basically a flathead with a huge chunk taken off from the center of it. But this is the only tool that I can find that can remove these weird screws. And as for what we are going to be replacing them with, we will be substituting them with M3 8mm self-tapping Phillips screws. Now with the screws removed, we need to separate the shell. Now, as you can see, there's a plastic tab here that holds the 2 shell pieces together. So the way I tackle this is by wrapping my thumb around the plastic tab and rock the front part of the shell side to side until it eventually separates. Now, alternatively, if you just want to get the board out, you can just gently lift the 2 halves of the shell and carefully extract the board, like so. Now that we have our cartridges open, we will primarily focus on these 4 boards as they cover the majority of what you would expect when changing the battery. So starting things off, we'll go with this NES board. So the majority of home console cartridges are going to be utilizing the CR22 through-hole battery. And to remove these through-hole batteries, what I like to do first is clip the leads here. That way the battery will slide out easier when we apply heat to these contacts. Which, speaking of, you will want a small knife edge tip for battery work. These have enough thermal mass to ensure solid welds and will transfer enough heat to cut through the most stubborn voltage and ground planes. After we pull the battery, we will simply clean the landings with a desoldering pump and braid. So when it comes to these home console cartridges, I strongly prefer to replace these batteries with a socket and a regular CR2032 coin cell battery. Now, I know people go on about the potential of the battery popping out from dropping it, but from my experience, that hasn't happened once. And I have spiked many of these cartridges by pure accident with the socket installed. As long as you make absolute sure the battery is securely in place, it will not pop out. So let me show you how to install one of these. So the first order of business is we need to prep this socket, and the reason why is because this is actually a surface mount part and we're going to be converting it into a through hole part. So all we need to do is fan these 2 tabs out. So what I like to do is take some flush cuts and don't squeeze really hard, but just gently bend the tab out. Now be careful, these legs are a little fragile, but you just want enough of a bend to where it forms a 90-degree angle. And you just repeat on both sides. And good to go. All we have to do now, take our socket, place it into the battery hole. Now, this is why I like to use braid and a pump. You want to make sure that these holes are as clear as possible. That way the socket will actually sit in. If you're getting a lot of resistance when putting the socket in place, that means you haven't cleared the hole all the way. But as you can see, we got the socket in, so let's solder it up and put on the battery. Now, one last thing I need to mention about the socket method is you want to make sure that the board clears the landing for the shell. What I mean by that is you want to make sure that when you put the board back in, it will actually fit in the shell, because depending on where the battery is placed, it could actually obstruct something inside the shell. And this isn't just for NES, this is also applying to Famicom, Genesis cartridges, Super Nintendo, things like that. Now, if it doesn't clear the landing, you do have a couple options. You could either keep the socketed battery where it is and clip the bit of plastic that's obstructing it, which I personally don't recommend, or you can mount the socket instead to the back of the PCB. Just something that I forgot to acknowledge after installing the socket, so I figured I'd bring it up now, so now you know. Now, another thing I want to talk about when it comes to the socket method is sometimes you may notice that when you put a socket on a cartridge PCB, it ends up obstructing some of the components that are already on the board. So what's one to do? Well, much like testing fitment for the cartridge cells themselves, you do have a couple options. You can either desolder the components that it's obstructing and relocate them to the back, or the easier method would be to just mount the battery holder on the back and just clip the exposed leads that are keeping it from sitting down. Now, this is the method that I'm going to use, but personally speaking, when I do these myself, I like to just relocate these components to the back. That way the battery socket is in the front of the PCB. But let me just show you how to do the alternative method. Unfortunately, not all cartridges are going to allow for a socketed battery. Now, in the case of this Madden NFL cartridge, it does have the provisions for a socketed battery, as you can see here. But, like I said, not all of them are like that. As you can see with this Madden NFL board, we only have provisions for the traditional through-hole battery. So, for this demonstration, since I don't actually have a shell for this one, we're going to install a traditional through-hole battery into this board. And the process is the same as the last one. We're just going to clip these tabs in order to make it easier to remove the battery. Alright, with the old battery removed, we can now install our new battery. Now, something I forgot to mention earlier, but you want to pay attention to the polarity in which you are inserting these batteries. Typically speaking, the written side of these batteries are going to be your positive, but always double check just to make sure. Now, in terms of where we're going to place it on this board, the positive side is on the left, while the negative side is on the right. So let's go ahead, remove this battery, and get it installed. Okay, so unfortunately I had to just remove the whole positive terminal because it was just way too thick and I was unable to cut it down. So what I did is I cut off the really thick positive terminal and replaced it with a small component leg. But now it should slot in very simply. And if you were using one of the cheaper Amazon batteries, this would not be an issue. This would just slot in to the positive terminal much more smoothly. But now we have the battery in place. We just solder it up and move on. Alright, next is Game Boy, and you may see that I've already changed the battery at some point in time. Well, I'm not really happy with the quality of this battery, so I'm just going to go ahead and replace it with a battery that I got from Console 5. Now, you may have also noticed that the tabs on these, on this battery in particular, has been cut. And the reason why is because the tabs on these originally are like super duper long, so you want to cut them down so that way they'll properly fit in a Game Boy Color or Game Boy cartridge. So we're just going to go ahead, get this battery removed, and replace it with this nice Panasonic battery. And now we've landed on Game Boy Advance. Now, there are some Game Boy Advance games that utilize the battery for save functionality. However, the most common application for battery changes for Game Boy Advance cartridges would be like Pokemon Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald, as well as like the Boktai games. What those games have in common is that they have a real-time clock feature. Their saves are not stored within SRAM, which is what's typical for battery back saves. They're stored in flash memory, so the saves never go away when you change the battery. Rather, what happens is the functionality of the real-time clock system ceases to function when the battery is no longer functional. Now, when it comes to changing out the batteries for a real-time clock cartridge on a Game Boy Advance cartridge, I want to make that very clear, this only applies to Game Boy Advance. It's not as simple as just changing out the battery, because due to the fact that the real-time clock system has already been disabled due to the original battery going flat, when you install a new battery, it starts ticking time from whatever point in time in which the real-time clock decides to quote-unquote reprogram itself. And typically when it does that, it ends up giving an invalid year, time, or whatever, and real-time clock events will not work correctly as a result. So, in addition to changing out the battery, we will need to reprogram the real-time clock battery after we do so. So, let's get this battery removed and replace it with a CR1620, which I got this from Console 5 once again, and these tend to be much higher capacity than the CR1616s. Alright, now that we got the battery installed, we're just going to simply put Pokemon Ruby back in its shell. And we need to reprogram the real-time clock. Now, there's a couple of methods in which you can do this. You can use an R4 along with a DS or DS Lite that has the Game Boy Advance cartridge slot. And you can use a special bit of homebrew software that allows you to read and rewrite the real-time clock. Unfortunately, I don't have a working DS or DS Lite on hand, so instead, I'm going to be using my GBX cart reader. We're gonna plug it in. We're gonna get this hooked up to our PC and run a bit of software that allows us to reprogram the real-time clock. All right, so we're right here to the GBX cart read-write program by Inside Gadgets. And we have our copy of Pokemon Ruby hooked up. And as you can see right here, it says our real-time clock time is the year 200 with a first month, 5th day, zeros across the board except for 5 minutes and 9 seconds. So this is obviously not correct. And if we left it like this, the real-time clock system just wouldn't work at all. So let's reset that. So we're gonna hit enter. Please set the year. So we're gonna hit do 25. Please set the month. It's October, so 10. Please set the day. It's the as of the recording here, it's the 29th. Please set the day of week. It's Wednesday, so if we're going to assume that 0 is Sunday, so it's going to be 1, 2, 3. So 03. Please set the hour. It is currently 12:01 a.m. because I just like to do this stuff at night, so it's going to be 00. Please set the minute. So we're going to do 03, and I'm going to wait until the clock hits 12:03 before I hit enter. Okay, now we're going to do 10 seconds. Press enter twice to confirm. Now it's going to read and rewrite everything. And there we go. Real-time clock has been fixed. So now the real-time clock event should work just as normal. All right, with the batteries changed out, we now can move on to the next step, and that is changing the capacitors and cleaning the cartridge edges. Now you may notice the Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance boards aren't pictured here, and the reason why is because those don't have any electrolytes for me to change out, and cleaning the edges is the same across the board. Now, you might be asking yourself, why do we need to change the electrolyte capacitors? Well, the reason why is because I have received many cartridges over time where the capacitors are in varying states of functionality. Most of the time they do work, but sometimes I do get cartridges where the capacitors are blown, they are out of spec, and when that happens, usually it stops these cartridges from working correctly. Either they freeze at some point in time in the game, or in the worst case scenario, they just won't boot at all. Now, in hindsight, we probably should have changed the capacitors before installing the batteries, but you know, you live and you learn. So, what kind of capacitors are we going to be replacing them with, though? So, when it comes to Nintendo boards, most cases they use 22 microfarad 6.3 volt capacitors. But in some cases, like this Famicom board here, it uses a 22 microfarad capacitor as well as a 1 microfarad 50 volt capacitor. So always pay attention to that before just assuming that all of them use the same capacitor. Now, for Sega Genesis, on the other hand, whether it's EA or standard cartridges, they all use 47 microfarad 16 volt capacitors. So just keep that in mind when ordering caps for the purpose of replacing them on these boards. So I'm going to go ahead and get my 22 microfarads and my 47 microfarads, and we're going to swap out these capacitors. But in terms of like showing how I go about this, we're going to go with Zoda's Revenge here, just to show the whole process of changing the caps and cleaning the edge. So changing the capacitors is actually pretty simple. All we're going to do is we're going to tin up the pads, hit it with a desoldering gun, and then just plop in a new capacitor. Now, you want to pay attention to polarity because these are polarized. In most cases, it will be marked on the board as to which side is positive, as you can see here with this capacitor. But in some cases, like with this capacitor here, either the positive marking might be obstructed by your replacement battery, or it just won't be on the PCB at all. So what I like to do is, to be on the safe side, is take a picture of the board itself just to make sure that you get your positive and negative polarities correct. So I'm going to fire up my ZD915, zip these capacitors out, and plop in some new ones. Alright, last order of business is we just need to clean the cartridge edge. Now, depending on the cartridge that you get, you may notice that the cartridge edge is in varying degrees of condition here. Like, you can see right along here, it has not a super thick layer of oxidation, but pretty noticeable layer. Meanwhile, if you flip to the back, that doesn't look that bad. So in situations like this, what I like to do is I like to get these. This is a sand and pencil eraser. It's sometimes called a ink and pencil eraser, but same ordeal. So for particularly light spots, what I usually like to do is take the pencil eraser and just go over it like this. Because it's a rather soft material and it's not like super abrasive, you don't have to worry about stripping the gold plating, and it does a pretty good job at getting rid of some light corrosion. But let's say that you have a particularly heavy spot. Well, this is where the sand eraser comes into play. Now, unlike the pencil eraser, you don't want to go side to side with this. You actually want to go parallel with the contacts. And you also don't want to go too rough because you can run the risk of stripping the gold plating. But all you really need to do is just go up and down very gently. And just go along the cartridge. And as you can see, that cleared up beautifully. So we're just going to do it over here. Now, I only recommend doing this if the oxidation is not only extremely noticeable, but also rather thick. Because you can run the risk of accidentally stripping the gold plating. So don't do this unless you absolutely need to. But now that we got the contacts cleaned up, we're just going to take some 91% isopropyl and wipe this up. And it's good to go. Alright, so with the capacitors replaced, the cartridge edges cleaned up, and the batteries replaced, all that's left to do now is to just put them back in their shells. And with that, that's all there really is to it when it comes to changing cartridge batteries. Now, these are all the cartridges that I've completed either on or off camera, and sometimes it's really simple, and other times it's a little more complicated, but overall, actually changing the battery is not super hard. You just gotta take your time, be patient, and also don't apply too much heat to the battery so it doesn't explode. But anyways, that's all there really is to it. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you liked what you saw, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. And as always, until the blue moon rises, I'll see you next time.